Okay, so thinking back to our last lecture, which we just finished, we learned about the different divisions of the nervous system, and we talked about the two things that make up the central nervous system, which are pictured here, and that is our brain and spinal cord. Okay, we're going to kind of spend just a few slides introducing the spinal cord. We'll kind of pick up more about the spinal cord in the next lecture. We'll spend, I'd say, the majority of this lecture talking about the brain, all of its parts, and what they each do. Okay.
Is that you?
That's not me. Just roasted me today.
Count me on that one.
Now, we also talked in our last lecture about gray and white matter. Gray and white matter are found both in the spinal cord and the brain. We basically know all this, but I'll go ahead and read it anyway. Gray matter has a relatively dull color because of the fact that it's got very little myelin. It also appears gray because of what we call nestle bodies, which are the organelles of these cell bodies. Okay, and they are what impart that gray color. What's important about the gray matter? It's the site of synaptic contact. So it's where those synapses take place between neurons. So in other words, where neurotransmitters are released, what we just got been talking about. What's more important, it's the site of all synaptic integration or information processing in the central nervous system. So this is where we decide what to do with like sensory signals, and like examples like we've been talking about all semester long. When we're cold, we decide what to do with that information when we send it into the spinal cord and brain, and we shiver as a result, right? Okay, so gray matter is obviously very important. Okay, it contains the cell bodies of motor neurons and interneurons. White matter is white in appearance, very bright and white, and it gets its appearance because of the abundance of myelin. It has a lot of myelin and axons. Okay, and the bundles of axons in the spinal cord in the brain are referred to as tracts. Okay, they carry signals up and down the spinal cord, which is basically all that the white matter in your spinal cord does. Think of your white matter in the spinal cord like an elevator. Does two things, right? It goes up and it goes down. Okay? The white matter that carries signals up the spinal cord are called sensory or ascending. Ascending means they're going up. The ones that carry the signals down are called motor or descending. Okay. Well, in our brain, we've got those types. I don't have it listed here, but I'm going to go ahead and talk about it. We also got in our brain white matter that can carry signals from like the front of our brain to the back, or vice versa, or from one side of the brain to the other. Okay. We'll talk about those three types of tracks here later in this lecture. Now, I want to introduce a little bit about kind of structural makeup of the spinal cord and how it works. The gray matter specifically, I'll start with, of the spinal cord forms an interior H shape, and you can see what it looks like. It's kind of turned a little bit sideways, but we've got kind of four major horns, what we call two dorsal horns and two ventral horns. Now, if you've taken anatomy, you should recognize the words dorsal and ventral. If you don't, dorsal or posterior, those two terms are the same thing, means towards the back of the body. Ventral anterior means towards the front of the body. Okay, and ventral anterior mean the same thing. Okay, let's talk about the dorsal horns as they're labeled as down here at the bottom. They are where we receive impulses coming into the spinal cord by way of afferent or sensory neurons, like this blue one here, which is a unipolar neuron. You can see there's the cell body off to the side, and we can see in blue action potentials for sensations. So they're going to be the ones carrying signals into the spinal cord for things like when we're itchy, when we're hot, when we're cold, so on and so forth. Okay, so they come into the back of the spinal cord, where a synapse occurs between that original sensory neuron and a interneuron. Okay, the one shaded there in purple, which, as we learned in the gray matter, is where synaptic contact takes place. Here's synaptic contact. Here's another example of synaptic contact, okay, between that interneuron and a motor neuron. Remember, the interneurons are the ones that do the information processing. They decide what to do with that information. Okay, maybe we just want to take our hand off that hot stove like we've been talking about. Okay, so we bring that signal in, ow, it hurts, decide what to do with it. So we immediately send the signal back out by way of a motor neuron that carries the signal out to our skeletal muscles to cause them to contract, get your hand off that hot stove. Okay, what I basically just described is stuff we'll get into more in our next lecture, what we call a reflex arc. One of the things that our spinal cord does It acts as reflex arc for things like the flexor withdrawal reflex when we touch something hot, okay? Or that knee jerk reflex that I've already kind of mentioned when you tap on the patellar tendon, okay? But in many cases, this illustration is pretty simple because it doesn't really even show how signals can cross from one side of the spinal cord to the other. Notice that there's what we call the gray commissure. It's not labeled, but that's what this is right here, which connects the left and right sides, okay? That's just the crossbar of the H. At the center of that is what we call the central canal, where we find circulating cerebrospinal fluid, which is that fluid we learned the other day, produced by ependymal cells circulating, and it's found in this like little chamber of our spinal cord called the central canal. Okay. Now going back to the signal coming out, I didn't mention this, but this is what we call the ventral horn or ventral gray horn. That's where the signal comes out from our somatic motor neurons, eventually going to our skeletal muscles. Now, in our spinal cord between T1 and L1 vertebrae, we also have two lateral horns. Okay, if you think about T1 through L1 vertebrae, it's kind of like the middle of your chest to your middle of your back, whatever you want to think of it. Okay, kind of middle part of our torso, if you want to say it that way. Okay, well, what do we know about autonomic motor neurons? They're the ones that carry the signals out, not to skeletal muscle, but to the things that are controlled automatically. Things like our cardiac muscle, our smooth muscle, and our glands. Well, think about all those involuntarily or automatically controlled organs that are right there in the middle of our torso. Our heart's right there. So will be a lot of the other things, smooth muscle, the stomach, intestines, okay, a lot of glands and so on and so forth in that area. So it makes sense that we're going to have lateral horns nearby those involuntarily controlled organs. Okay. Now in our brain, we don't have a picture of our brain. We have gray matter that forms the shell of our two largest parts, what we call the cerebrum and the cerebellum. Okay, we call these two regions the cerebral cortex and the cerebellar cortex. Between the two, we'll talk much more about the cerebral cortex. This is where some of the most high-level brain functioning comes from. Your ability to understand the words that I'm speaking right now, to understand that I'm speaking words and I'm not singing. Okay, to understand what you see, to separate us from other animals that don't do things like read and write and plan for the future. You know, I always say, like, think about like your dog. If you have a dog, I've got two of them. Okay, their life is governed completely by, you know, getting their belly rubbed, getting treats. Okay, they're not thinking about their future. They're not going to class, sitting, listening to an instructor talk about the brain. Okay, we have a very complicated cerebral cortex, as we'll find out. Okay, so that's the gray matter. Okay, now obviously you can see here in our picture, there's also white matter, and the spinal cord, the white matter surrounds that inner gray matter. And this illustration, as I said, is pretty simplified because it is showing a signal coming into the spinal cord going back out without any interaction between the gray and the white matter. That's not the case at all. Even if it's a spinal reflex like the knee jerk reflex or the flexor withdrawal reflex, we're still going to involve signals going up and down the spinal cord using that white matter, okay, which surrounds the anterior H form of the gray matter, which is the reverse of what we see in our brain. In our brain, both in the cerebrum and the cerebellum, the white matter is on the inside, deep to that superficial layer of gray matter. And we've already seen these two pictures, I believe, from our last lecture, so I'll kind of just jump ahead to our next slide, where we can kind of now see some more of a bit more of a complicated image and how white matter crossing over from one side of the spinal cord can take place. The organization of the gray matter allows it to function as a reflex arc, which I've already talked about, or a signal, sensory signal that enters the spinal cord, it's processed, and then exits out as a motor impulse. That's one of the most important things that our spinal cord does. Okay, but also very important about our spinal cord is that it's going to associate with the white matter and carry signals up and down and connect the periphery with the brain. Okay, connect your arms and legs with the brain. Okay, now the spinal tracts of the white matter conduct impulses both up and down. If they're going up, we would call them sensory or ascending tracts, which are shaded here in the color blue, whereas the motor or descending tracts are shaded here in red, which would be carrying the signals down from the brain. So aside from acting as a integrating center for reflex arcs, our spinal cord also promotes homeostasis by propagating action potential along those tracts. The name of a tract often indicates its position in the white matter and where it begins and ends. White matter contains both sensory and motor tracts. I've said that many times. When nerve impulses from sensory receptors propagate up the spinal cord to the brain, they do so along two main routes on each side, what we call the spinothalamic tract and the posterior column. The spinothalamic tract conveys nerve impulses for sensing pain, warmth, coolness, itching, and tickling. So if you're feeling itchy or you're tickled or you're warm, those signals are going up to your brain by way of what's called the spinothalamic tract. We call it the spinothalamic tract because it's using the spinal cord, and guess where it's going to go? To the thalamus in your brain, which we haven't talked about yet. You may not know that, but we'll talk definitely about the thalamus on Friday. The posterior column, there's two tracts, the gracile fasciculus, cuneate fasciculus. There's some wild words there, and I don't really care about you knowing them. What I do want you to know is what the posterior column tracts convey, which is nerve impulses for touch, pressure, vibration, and then one of the most complicated sensations we have. It's hard to, in my opinion, to kind of understand and visualize, but this is what we call conscious proprioception. And I have in parentheses, it's the awareness of positions and movements of muscles, tendons, and joints. Basically, it's like your body's awareness of itself in a three-dimensional space, something that's very important for just like walking and chewing gum at the same time. Understanding like when you jump, you're in the air, you can sense and feel that, get your body ready to land and that kind of stuff. Yeah. So make sure you know what the posterior column tracts convey, what the spinothalamic tracts convey as far as the different senses is kind of the main thing I want you to know. So those are the tracts that carry signals up. Okay. Well, we've also got motor tracts that carry signals down. Okay. And when we're talking about signals coming down, we're talking about them originally starting up in the brain. Okay. And I've already mentioned it, but our cerebral cortex, that very outer part of our cerebrum, is where the high level function of our brain takes place. It allows you to understand what I'm saying and speaking and you're seeing and that kind of stuff. But it's also the division of our brain that plays a major role in controlling precise voluntary movements. So it's the division or the part of our brain, I should say, that's working right now as you take your notes. So when you contract those muscles in your hands, those signals are originating back up in the cerebral cortex. But other parts of our brain provide important integration for regulating autonomic movements, which are those that we control without our conscious control or our awareness in many cases. Okay. Motor output to skeletal muscles travel down the spinal cord in two types of descending pathways, direct and indirect. The direct pathways, I'm not even going to read them off because there's a lot of big fancy words there. What you need to know is what they do is the second sense, convey nerve impulses originating in the cerebral cortex, destined to cause voluntary movements of skeletal muscles.
So we don't need to know either of the first two sentences.
No, just basically no direct pathway is involved with causing voluntary muscle contractions. Okay. So you're using that right now as you highlight that sentence. Okay. Your indirect pathways include several that I'm not going to read either. Okay, but they convey nerve impulses from the brainstem to cause what we'd call automatic movements. Now, not automatic movements of like your heart muscle, your smooth muscle, your glands, but instead movements that are automatically associated with your skeletal muscle. Things like muscle tone, which is involuntary contractions that are taking place in our muscles all the time. Even when we feel like when we're laying in bed and we're as relaxed as we're going to be, your muscles are really finely, really tiny contractions are taking place. That's what muscle tone is. Okay. Other automatic movements include things that help with like regulating posture and balance so that we don't fall over or tip over, and like orienting our head and body. Okay. Make sense? And you can see those are all illustrated in the picture at the bottom. Red shown for motor descending, blue for sensory ascending, but I'm not really worried about you knowing any of that stuff. With that said, we will pick up more with the spinal cord, talk a lot more about spinal cord reflexes on our next lecture. Don't put everything away. We still have a couple minutes. I'm going to do these next two slides. What we'll do from here on out in this lecture is talk about the brain. Okay, before we start talking about what the parts of the brain do, with some introductory stuff, we'll begin by talking about feeding your brain. Okay, something very important. Even though our brain only represents about 2% of our total body weight, it consumes up to around 20% of the oxygen and glucose at rest, or used at rest. So a very significant amount of blood goes to our brain. And the reason that we have to send so much blood up to our brain, because our neurons synthesize ATP almost exclusively from glucose via reactions that use oxygen. In other words, our neurons like to go through aerobic respiration. Okay. When active neurons and neuroglia increase in a region of the brain, blood flow to that area also increases. That's kind of straightforward. Also, something that was really cool, discovered by scientists. I imagine that's kind of how a lot of them figured out what different parts of the brain did. They just followed where the blood went. Okay. Because virtually no glucose is stored in the brain, and reactions used to make ATP from glucose, the supply of glucose and oxygen to the brain must be continuous. Think about how long you can survive without continuous blood supply to your brain. Okay, not very long, right? A couple minutes. Okay. Blood that's low in glucose, what we call hypoglycemia, entering the brain can cause mental confusion, dizziness, convulsions, even possible loss of consciousness, something that a person like diabetes would really need to be careful of, because it can be very detrimental to their health. Also could be fatal if they don't fix the situation. Very closely associated with blood is what we call the blood-brain barrier, which we learned a little bit about in our last lecture. Okay. Protects our brain cells from harmful substances and pathogens by preventing passage of many substances from our brain, or from our blood into brain tissue. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's a barrier for some stuff to leave the blood and screw up brain functioning. We learned that the cell is called astrocytes, and we can see a couple of their processes forming the blood-brain barrier. Okay. Now, does that mean nothing can leave the blood? No, some stuff absolutely does need to. Things that are water soluble, like glucose, can cross the blood-brain barrier by facilitated diffusion. This means they need those transport proteins. Other substances like creatinine, urea, most ions can cross the blood-brain barrier very slowly. Things that are lipid soluble, like oxygen, carbon dioxide, steroid hormones, alcohol, barbiturates, nicotine, and caffeine, can easily cross the blood-brain barrier. Imagine you guys know most of those things listed there. No college student knows what alcohol is, though, right? And nicotine, we all know that's in, like, tobacco products. Caffeine, everybody knows what caffeine is. Anybody ever heard of barbiturates before? They're a type of drug that really doesn't get used anymore, not like illicit drugs, but they kind of became illicit drugs. They were used a lot for various mental health situations, so I'll just kind of describe it that way. They were prescribed a lot quite a while ago, like 15, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, but they were highly addictive. So they found some better stuff to use. Just a second. All right, and then proteins, most antibiotic drugs do not pass at all from blood into brain tissue. So the blood-brain barrier prevents them from leaving the blood at all. All right, we will stop here and we will pick up with cerebrospinal fluid on Friday.